My name is Lauren Hayes, and my mother cut off all contact with a single email. For the good of the family, take a step back for a while. No explanation. No phone call. 6 hours later, I withdrew the entire amount, over $3 million, I had contributed to the family. And since then, the phone hasn't stopped ringing. Have you ever been pushed out of something you poured your heart into, all because of one cold message? This isn't just a story about betrayal. It's the story of how I stood back up, when my entire family turned their backs and only remembered me when they needed money. If you've ever been dismissed by the people who were supposed to stand by you, leave a comment, subscribe, and share this story. Maybe it's your story too. And that was just the beginning of what they never saw coming. Since I was a kid, I always knew my place in the Hayes family. No one ever said it out loud, but the looks, the gestures, the way everyone reacted whenever Rachel entered the room. It all made me feel like a shadow trailing behind her. Rachel is 3 years older than me, tall, blonde, and had been called the future heir since she was 15. My parents never missed a chance to talk about her accomplishments. Massachusetts State Debate Champion, first place in the National Science Fair, full ride to Harvard. And me. When I earned a scholarship to Stanford, my dad just nodded and said, "Not bad for someone studying the wrong field." I studied finance and started working part-time at a small investment firm in Menlo Park by my sophomore year. Every night, after clocking out at 9 p.m., I'd sit in my tiny dorm room, eat a cold sandwich, and pore over stock charts like it was the only way I could survive the expectations I could never meet. My father, Charles Hayes, was strict, controlling, and talked like a financial report. He never yelled or raised a hand. But whenever I said something he disagreed with, he'd peer over his glasses, nod, and say, "Not wrong, but Rachel would have done it differently." And every time, something inside me clenched. After graduation, I was hired by one of the top venture capital firms in Silicon Valley. I didn't tell anyone at home. Just emailed them my new schedule and signed the contract. 3 months later, when the family threw a party for Rachel's appointment as CEO of Hayes & Co., I stood silently among the crowd, holding a glass of wine, and listened to my father speak about his 2 wonderful daughters. He called Rachel his pride and said I had a bit of luck in her career. I remember smiling faintly, quietly leaving the party early, going back to the hotel, and finishing the investment report I was preparing for a rising medical startup. The favoritism wasn't just in words. Rachel got the entire 21st floor penthouse, over 2,000 square feet, with a private elevator and Italian furniture handpicked by her mother. Me, I was assigned a tiny attic room behind the company office, originally a file storage room, later renovated so I could work conveniently. I didn't complain. I changed the curtains, set up a small desk by the window, and bought a few potted plants to warm up the space. At night, after everyone had left the building, I'd stand before a whiteboard in that little attic, analyzing financial models and testing investment algorithms I was developing on my own. That was where I felt most at peace, where I could be myself without anyone telling me to do it like Rachel. Despite being overlooked, I kept working relentlessly. I took part in funding campaigns, built relationships with investors my father had once deemed unreliable, many of whom would later pour millions into the deals I led. Yet somehow, the credit always circled back to Rachel. Once, during a strategy meeting with a group of international investors, I presented a comprehensive expansion plan into Southeast Asia, complete with data and risk analysis. My father cut me off midway and said, "Let Rachel explain that part. Her voice is clearer and more persuasive." I didn't argue. I stepped back, sat down, and let my sister explain a plan I had written myself. At the end of the meeting, one of the investors shook my hand and whispered in lightly accented English, "You should have been allowed to speak more." I just smiled and replied, "It's okay. I'm used to it." But what hurt the most wasn't being dismissed by others. It was that I started dismissing myself. I learned to step aside, to accept applause meant for someone else. I told myself that as long as I still had a seat at the table, I had a chance to prove myself. I don't know when I started calling my submission patience. Maybe it was one rainy night, After I finalized an investment deal for a chain of mental health clinics and saw Rachel on the news being praised as the financial architect behind Hayes & Co.'s new humanitarian initiative. No one knew I had negotiated every clause and cut every budget line to make it profitable. I simply turned off the TV, poured myself another glass of water, and started drafting the next client proposal. I lived that way for 7 years, until the day I received that email from my mother. One decisive sentence, one cold act, and for the first time in my life, I couldn't swallow it. I couldn't sit quietly anymore, pretending to be the extra piece in a family that didn't want to see me succeed. I couldn't keep my head down, knowing I was the one holding this legacy together, and I acted. That was when the game started to change, but they didn't know that yet. My mother fell ill one afternoon in early March. I was in Portland meeting with a group of healthcare investors when I got a call from Rachel. No greeting, no concern, just 4 words: "Mom's in the hospital." I left the meeting and caught the next flight back to Seattle. When I arrived, my dad and Rachel were already sitting in the 3rd-floor hallway of the neurology wing. Mom had just been admitted to the ICU for a minor stroke. The doctors said she was stable for now, but needed close monitoring. I walked up and tried to keep my voice calm. "How is she?" My dad didn't answer right away. He looked toward the white-painted door and said hoarsely, "The doctor said she's still responsive, but they don't know when she'll wake up." I sat down, gripping my bag's handle. My mind still buzzed from the airport noise, but my heart was already numb. 3 days later, with no sign of improvement, Rachel told me to go home and rest. "You look worn out. Go shower, get some sleep. I'll call if anything changes." I nodded. But instead of heading to my attic room, I drove to the Hayes & Co. headquarters. I don't know why. Maybe I needed something familiar, something stable, while everything else was falling apart. The office was quieter than usual. I walked past the main conference room, where countless strategy meetings I had helped shape had taken place, and something felt off. My father's office door, normally locked tight when he was away, was ajar. Inside, the computer screen was still glowing. I reached to close the door, but my eyes caught on a thick folder sitting neatly on his desk. I'm not a snoop, but the bold print on the front stopped me cold. Internal executive transfer. Hayes & Co. below it. Rachel Hayes, acting CEO, effective March 1st. My hands went cold. I opened the file. Every page was filled with signatures, internal notarizations, and even meeting minutes between my father, the company attorney, and Rachel. I wasn't there. Not a single line mentioned my role in the entire 3-year business strategy. No explanation as to why the person responsible for 80% of current growth wasn't even invited to the meeting. I grabbed the file and stormed out of the office. My chest felt crushed by an invisible boulder. I don't remember how I drove back to the hospital. I only remember that when I walked into the waiting room, my dad was standing alone by the window. I held up the file. "What is this, Dad?" He turned around, his expression calm, like this had been decided long ago. A necessary decision given the current situation. "Why, Rachel? I've led the entire investment strategy for the past 3 years. He paused, then replied flatly. "Rachel has the family vision. You only think in numbers." I went numb. Only think in numbers. Me, the one who had stuck with every balance sheet, every risk analysis, every difficult client, was dismissed just because I didn't fit the family way of doing business? I took a deep breath. "Is that what you really think?" He didn't answer, just looked at me like he was done with the conversation. But really, it had never been a conversation. I walked away. But before I left the hospital hallway, I looked back at him one last time. "I don't need to do everything the family's way to be loyal, Dad. Sometimes it's the different approach that keeps a company from falling apart. If that moment hit a nerve for you, leave a comment with "I get it, mark your place here, and let's keep going." The peak is yet to come. I left the hospital in the rain. Drove aimlessly around Lake Union for nearly 3 hours. Didn't call anyone. Didn't check emails. Just thought. I didn't argue. I didn't challenge anyone. I didn't get angry. But from that moment on, I knew this. If my family only saw my worth when it served their so-called tradition, then it was time I created a new one. No permission needed. No approval required. just truth. And this time, I wasn't stepping back. I stayed up all night, sitting alone in the little attic they always called my temporary room. Rain dotted the windows. The streetlight cast a pale yellow hue into the room. On my laptop, I pulled up every document tied to the Hayes Legacy Fund, the very thing I'd quietly built behind the scenes for 10 years, now existing under a name that never once credited me for being its architect. My father had created the fund over 20 years ago, calling it the financial bloodstream of the family, his favorite phrase at every holiday gathering. Members didn't just contribute money. They contributed trust, or at least what they thought was trust. But the reality couldn't have been further from that polished story. Over the past 8 years, I had contributed nearly $4 million. Every cent hard-earned profits I'd generated from deals that the company still listed under the Hayes Collective. I never got my fair share, but I kept going. Because deep down, I believed I was part of something. I was the daughter. I was family. I was wrong. Ever since I saw Rachel's name on that CEO handoff, no notice, no invitation to the meeting, my internal boundaries began to shift. I no longer felt the need to preserve a family legacy when the very people who built it had no intention of acknowledging the one who'd sustained it. So I acted. I logged into the Hayes Legacy Fund system with the high-level access no one ever noticed I still had, or maybe they'd never cared enough to imagine I'd use it. I reviewed the contribution breakdown. My name accounted for 37% of the entire fund, more than anyone, including my father, who loved to call himself the pillar. I sat there, hands trembling, heart slow but steady. I wasn't doing anything illegal. My contributions were mine. So were the earnings. I read the bylaws. Every member had the right to withdraw their share with written notice through the system, and any uncommitted investments would be reimbursed after calculating corresponding profits. I drafted the withdrawal notice, polite, professional. No accusations, no drama, just a transparent, lawful action. I signed, attached the verification code, and hit submit. $5.4 million, my principal and post-tax earnings, were transferred out in 3 separate transactions, routed to 3 different accounts under legal entities I controlled. All legitimate, all fully audited. I had been preparing for this quietly for 3 years, ever since I realized recognition would never come. When it was done, I shut the laptop. No thrill, no celebration, just an eerie calm. Like a room right after a storm. I made myself a cup of tea, sat by the window, and watched the raindrops hit the balcony railing. What I felt wasn't rebellion. It was freedom. 6 hours later, the tremors began. I was having breakfast at a quiet cafe near Queen Anne when my phone started buzzing nonstop. First call. Uncle Edward, the fund's operations overseer. Then Aunt Helen. Then the internal finance chief. A message from Rachel popped up next. Lauren, we need to talk. Call me ASAP. I didn't respond. I took a slow sip of coffee, opened my laptop, and logged into the bank's administrative portal. Transaction status. Completed. No errors. No compliance flags. Every step had followed protocol. They couldn't touch me. And I knew that would terrify them more than anything. Before 10 a.m., my father called. I let it ring 3 times before answering. What's going on, Lauren? He jumped straight in. What do you mean? Why did the bank alert us to a nearly $6 million withdrawal from the fund? Do you understand how this destabilizes our liquidity? I only withdrew what's mine. I didn't touch anyone else's. But that money belongs to the family. My portion, Dad. My contributions, my profits, it's all documented. I followed the bylaws. Why didn't you say something first? Kind of like how you handed the company over to Rachel without saying a word to me? Silence. I continued, calm but firm. I'm not blowing anything up. I'm simply stepping away from a place where my presence was never respected. On the other end of the line, I heard a heavy breath. Maybe for the first time, my father realized my true position wasn't about where I sat in the boardroom, but about the weight I carried in the entire operational structure. I hung up after a short goodbye, Dad. No shouting, no tears. Only truths they once ignored, now slamming into them cold and exact, like the numbers in the financial system I'd dedicated my life to understanding. And I knew they hadn't seen the full extent of what I could do. This was just the beginning. I sat alone in my living room, the lights of Seattle casting long, cold beams across the glass walls. In my hand was a glass of red wine, swirling in slow, deliberate circles. Out there, the world kept spinning, bright, indifferent, as if there wasn't a family reeling from a silent but calculated capital withdrawal. My phone lay face down on the table, but the vibration kept pulsing against the glass, rhythmic, anxious, like the pounding heart of someone in panic. I didn't need to check the screen to know who it was. Rachel had called me 17 times in less than 3 hours. The first message, "Call me back now." Then, "What are you doing?" Next, "This is seriously impacting the Southridge deal." And finally, just 3 words, "We need you." I laughed, a quiet tilt of the wine glass filled with irony. Rachel, my older sister, who used to sit at the head of the table looking at me like I was the intern who never quite measured up, was now the one writing those words. 3 simple words, but laced with something deeper: acknowledgement. The Southridge deal. I'd heard whispers a few months back from former colleagues in the investment community. A healthcare complex development project, diagnostic center, specialty care units, post-treatment services, set to break ground in North Seattle. Initial investment, $22 million. Hayes & Co. was the lead equity partner, primarily responsible for securing cash flow in the first phase. The problem? $8 million of that capital came from the Hayes Legacy Fund, which meant a third of it was technically my money, and now, with my full withdrawal, plus the profit I'd generated over the years, the deal was teetering. They couldn't cover the shortfall. Partners were getting nervous. Lenders were pulling back without solid financial guarantees, and my sister, the freshly minted CEO, was losing control. I stood, poured a little more wine, took a sip, and stepped onto the balcony. The March night air was crisp, almost soothing. The city at night was beautiful but distant. Just like the feeling I always had looking at the headquarters of Hayes & Co. Walls lined with my mother's paintings, my father's plaques, and not one line mentioning the numbers I'd once used to pull them out of the 2020 recession. The phone buzzed again. This time, FaceTime? I didn't answer. A minute later, a message popped up. "Lauren, please. Everything's falling apart. Southridge might collapse. If we don't finalize disbursement in 24 hours, we lose it all." I sat down on the wooden balcony chair, crossed my legs, leaned back, took a deep breath. Funny, really. I used to wish, desperately, for a moment when she'd say she needed me. Not out of obligation, but out of recognition. But now that it finally happened, I didn't feel joy. I felt release, like slipping out of a corset that had squeezed the breath out of me for decades. I picked up my phone and typed a single reply. "If you want to talk, 10 a.m. tomorrow. My private office, not headquarters. And you come alone, with the actual Southridge plan. No clean printouts. Bring the real spreadsheet." 10 seconds later, agreed. I flipped my phone face down again, got up, and closed the balcony door. That night, I didn't dream. I didn't feel anxious. I didn't feel tense. Only a steady, quiet awareness. I was no longer waiting to be seen. For the first time in my life, I was the one they called in to save what they once believed could survive without me. If you've ever been forgotten, then begged for when someone's desperate, share this with the person who needs your fire back. I spent the entire evening before preparing my living room into a proper meeting space. Not some mahogany, velvet-draped conference room at Hayes & Co., where my father sat at the head like a corporate general, but something modern, open, and honest, like the way I'd been working all along, unseen. A long oak table in the center, seating for 8 comfortably. Each spot had its own packet. The original Southridge contract, the capital breakdown from the Hayes Legacy Fund, and my own spreadsheet pinpointing the deficit to the exact cent. I also prepared individual portfolios, showing past deals I'd been denied participation in, which later turned enormous profits. On the wall behind me, I pinned a hand-drawn financial model, arrows in different colors. It was something they once mocked as unprofessional, but now it was a favorite method for many of the high-net-worth clients I managed. I chose a deep navy suit, simple but sharply tailored, hair pulled back, no frills. The table was spotless, the surface gleaming. And at exactly 9:57 a.m., the doorbell rang. I glanced at the security camera. The delegation had arrived. My father led the group, his face stern but visibly tired. Behind him was Rachel. No sharp gaze, just tension. Uncle Edward, Aunt Helen, and Mr. Mark, our family lawyer, followed, hesitating at the steps like they weren't quite ready to face what was inside. I opened the door and nodded. "Come in, we'll meet in the conference room." No one said a word. They entered the house for the first time, my house, where I had built my own life, my own work, in silence. Their eyes scanned the space. An oil painting by a Seattle artist over the fireplace. Bookshelves crammed with investment documents, color-coded by strategy. They paused when they saw a poster-sized version of the Northeast expansion plan I pitched last year. The one they'd shot down, now displayed like a quiet reminder. "No one's asked what I've been doing for a while," I said softly. "So I figured this was the right time to show you." We sat down. I didn't sit right away. I stood at the head of the table, in front of the diagram. No mic, no slideshow, just my voice, calm, steady, and for the first time, not needing permission to be heard. "I invited you all here today," I began, "not to rehash the past, but because I believe you deserve the full truth, no filters, no polished versions." My father opened his mouth, but I lifted my hand slightly, polite but firm. "I'll present first, then everyone's free to ask anything they want." I started with the current status of the South Ridge deal. A shortfall of $7.8 million, a concrete figure that had brought the entire process to a halt. I pointed to the red line on the spreadsheet. This was the amount committed from the Hayes Legacy Fund. Out of that, over $3 million in principal and $2.4 million in profit came from my share, and as you all know, that portion has been withdrawn. I looked Rachel straight in the eye. She avoided my gaze. "The question we need to ask isn't why I pulled out. It's this. After all these years of contribution, why was I never part of a single decision, even when the profits I generated exceeded those of the entire strategic team combined?" No one answered. I turned to another page in the documents. It listed deals I had once proposed, rejected, only to be repackaged and presented later under someone else's name. One of them even had a note, "Initial idea from Lauren, pending review by Rachel." I turned to Mark, the lawyer. In Clause 9.3 of the fund's charter clearly states, "Any member has the right to withdraw capital if no binding commitments have been made to disbursed projects." Did I act within those rights? Mark nodded slowly. "From a legal standpoint, yes, completely." I stepped to the back wall and pointed to the green line on the financial model. "This is a risk projection if Southridge stalls for another 60 days. The figures are mine, updated from the local credit market just 3 days ago. Without timely cash flow, the bank will refuse to disburse Phase 2. I paused. "And if anyone here is wondering whether I plan to help, let me be clear, I'm not doing this out of family obligation. I'll act because I'm a professional investor. And I only put money into ventures that are clearly defined, transparent, and that respect the true value of those investing." My father looked up. The sternness in his face had softened. There was something different in his eyes, as if for the first time, he was seeing who I really was, not just the reflection cast by my sister's image. Rachel still kept her head down. Her hand gripped the edge of the folder, but she said nothing. I returned to my seat. My voice lowered. No longer that of a presenter, but someone finally closing a lifelong silence. "This is the home I bought myself, the company I run myself, the data I analyze myself, and the decision, this time, is mine. Now, I'm listening." The living room was so quiet I could hear the ticking of the wall clock. The faces around the table, once confident, powerful, were now still, uneasy, and unsure. I knew they were waiting for me to offer a way out, a lifeline from the mess they'd created. But I didn't rush. I let them sit in that silence for a few more seconds, just long enough for them to realize who really held the power in that room. I opened the final folder in front of me. Clean paper, black ink, neatly formatted, prepared 3 weeks ago. Not to threaten, but to offer one last chance. I'm willing to fund $4 million into Southridge, I said calmly, every word deliberate, as a loan agreement with a 3-year term, 5.8% interest, below the current market rate. No one reacted right away. Mark, the attorney, furrowed his brow first. He understood. This wasn't a gift. This wasn't some act of forgiveness from a daughter. It was a serious financial deal. I glanced at Rachel, her lips tightened. She got it, too. I slid an addendum across the table. However, the condition for this loan to proceed is that the investment division, the one I built and led, be officially separated into an independent legal entity called Hayes Strategic Capital, which I will run directly, with full authority over staffing, strategy, and capital allocation. My father looked up. He didn't reject it outright, but his eyes darkened like someone being forced to swallow a bitter pill from his doctor. You want to split off the company? He asked slowly. I want to formalize what's been true for the last 8 years, I replied. Up until now, it just wasn't acknowledged. But now I want it in legal writing. No ambiguity. No longer just the investment division, which in reality has been the financial backbone of Hayes & Co. And Mark cautiously flipped through the documents. Rachel finally spoke, softly but firmly. If we agree, would you still retain the right to leave the company in the future? Yes, but I would follow the new terms for exit and client transition. No one gets left behind if they do their part. None of them knew that I already had 16 major clients, worth over $300 million, signed under personal service contracts. And in those contracts was a clause. If I left Hayes, they had the right to transfer all assets to the new entity I would lead. And they had already confirmed in writing that they would do so upon my official notice. I didn't need to say that out loud. I didn't need to threaten. I just let them feel it. Mark was the first to break the silence. From a legal standpoint, I see nothing unreasonable in this proposal. Fair interest rate. Clear conditions. The separation is standard practice in multi-division corporations when all parties agree. My father leaned back, his hands clasped. This could set a bad precedent within the company. Other departments might demand autonomy. That's fine, I said. As long as they deliver real value, remain transparent, and take responsibility for capital, like I did. Rachel nodded slowly. Will you continue working with us if this is accepted? I don't promise anything beyond honoring the agreement, I answered, still calm. I'll do my part, if I'm given the space to actually do the work. At that moment, I could feel it. They understood. They understood I was no longer Lauren, the daughter with too many opinions who needed guidance. I was Lauren Hayes, the one who held real financial power, both in my hands and in my head. Don't go anywhere. The next part is when all the cards go on the table. Share this if this moment hit hard. My father placed both hands on the table, looked me in the eye again, and slowly said, We agree. Redraft the contract. But this time, no one ignores your name. I still remember the moment he signed the final page of the loan agreement. His hand hovered for a long time over the words, Lauren Hayes, legal representative and CEO of Hayes Strategic Capital. He looked at that name like he was finally realizing just how badly he had misjudged the worth of his own daughter for more than 3 decades. But what they didn't know was that this contract was only the beginning. As soon as the papers were signed, I stood, picked up the remote to the large screen mounted on the wall in my home's conference room. The white curtain lowered silently. I pressed a button, and the screen lit up. The logo appeared first, a simple emblem of 2 interlocked curves, and beneath it, the words, Lauren Hayes Investments. I turned back to face the table. Their expressions shifted from surprise to confusion, then caution. Rachel leaned forward, her brow slightly furrowed. This is, she asked instinctively. I've been running this company for the past 2 years, I said clearly, quietly, legally, independently. I clicked to the next slide, revealing the financial report. First year revenue, $1.2 million. Second year, $6.8 million. Net profit after tax, $3.1 million. Client retention rate, 100%. The firm focuses on VIP clients with a net worth of over $10 million, I explained. I use proprietary financial algorithms I personally developed, patented and registered with 5 official patents currently listed with the United States Patent and Trademark Office. Rachel sat up straighter. You launched a private company while still working for Hayes & Co. That's not a violation of any internal rules, I responded. My employment contract never included a non-compete clause against private investment activities, as long as I didn't solicit Hayes & Co. clients, and I followed that to the letter. I reached out and placed a stack of folders on the table. These are the 27 clients currently using services through Lauren Hayes Investments. All are independent portfolios, with no overlap with Hayes & Co. And most of them have already signed agreements stating they're ready to transfer their entire portfolios if I choose to change management entities. My father remained seated, his face pale. He didn't say a word, but I could see it. Beneath the calm surface, he was visibly shaken. He had never imagined that while he still viewed me as his inexperienced daughter, I had built a small empire, not with the Hayes name, but with my own. I'm not revealing this to provoke anyone, I continued. I'm sharing it because it's time everyone knew. If my proposed terms aren't implemented within the next 60 days, I will formally withdraw from the Hayes & Co. structure and shift all operations to my own firm. I paused for a beat. And I'm not alone. I clicked to the next slide. A list of senior investment advisors who had previously worked with Hayes & Co., but had been quietly collaborating with me in a pilot program for the past 3 quarters. A few names made Aunt Helen raise her eyebrows and Uncle Edward tap his fingers nervously on the table. We've developed our own advisory framework, proprietary simulation software, and a client data management system that I was never allowed to use at Hayes & Co. because it was deemed too complicated, too redundant. But at Lauren Hayes Investments, I have full authority to implement them, and the results speak for themselves. Rachel looked at me, no longer defiant. Just direct, thoughtful. What do you really want? I want to work to my full potential, without being forced to follow internal politics, without being interrupted mid-presentation by family input, without having to go in circles to be effective. I turned to my father, and I want to know, if I choose to leave, will you see it as betrayal, or as the beginning of something new? He stayed silent for a long time, then he exhaled. Long and deep. When he finally spoke, his voice was no longer that of a disappointed father, but of a leader slowly realizing the times had changed. You've gone farther than any of us ever dared to imagine. Maybe it's time we step back and take a better look. I nodded. I'll wait for an official decision. 60 days, no more. I turned off the screen. Nothing else needed to be said. For the first time in over 30 years of being a Hayes daughter, I didn't need permission to exist. I stood on my own under my own name, and to me, that was a revolution. 3 days after that pivotal meeting, I received an email from our in-house legal team. Attached was the restructuring agreement, signed by every member of the executive board, including my father. The final signature, beneath his name, was slightly slanted, no longer as firm as I'd seen before. There was something in that ink stroke that told me more than 1,000 explanations ever could. He had conceded. Just 3 years earlier, he had looked at me over his glasses and said slowly, "You're too emotional to lead. Women like you are too soft to keep their heads straight." And now, that same man had signed a contract I had drafted, laying the foundation for the investment division's independence, completely separate from the old family structure built on hierarchy and last names. Not because he wanted to, but because he had to choose between pride and the company's survival. Rachel was different. She said nothing in the weeks that followed. She still showed up to meetings, still sat in the CEO chair, still signed documents, and appeared in media events with a perfectly made-up face. But I knew, eventually, we all have to face ourselves. Exactly 4 weeks after the launch of Lauren Hayes Investments, I received a short letter in a cream-colored envelope, the handwriting unmistakably hers. Lauren, I'm not sure I'm the right person for this role anymore. Maybe I've spent too much time preserving an image instead of questioning efficiency. You did something no one in this family dared. You accepted the truth, and you acted on it. I'm resigning. Rachel. I read that letter 3 times. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel sadness. Just a sense of relief, like after a storm, when those who'd been holding their breath finally let go, just to breathe. I didn't reply. But the next morning, I sent a bouquet to Rachel's office, along with a small card. Thank you for your honesty. I never set out to tear anyone down. I didn't need to prove I was the winner. I just wanted to rebuild, from the ground up, with real value, transparency, and fairness. In the first week after restructuring, I publicly released a new employee evaluation system. No more roles handed out based on family ties. No more vague bonuses or meetings where dad's opinion is final. Instead, we applied a data-driven competency framework, performance, client feedback, portfolio growth metrics. Some people left. Some resisted. A few, especially those comfortable with the old way, said, "Lauren's making everything cold, like a machine." I didn't blame them. Change is uncomfortable, especially when it exposes gaps they used to hide under family tradition. But others stayed and flourished. Anita, a young advisor once dismissed from a meeting for being too green, now directly manages a $70 million portfolio. Within 3 quarters, she exceeded her profit target by 11%. Brandon, the tech guy labeled too out of touch with Hayes culture, was the one who designed the online dashboard our VIP clients now use daily. I gave people the space to redefine their roles by skill, not lineage, not by how many years they'd earned my father's trust. Of course, my father didn't take that lightly. In the first few months, he still barged into some meetings, sometimes calling staff directly to remind them of tasks in the old school way. But each time, I gently reminded him of the agreement he signed. Founding shareholder, no operational interference. For the first time, he gave me that fiery stare. But I held his gaze calmly and said, without raising my voice more than necessary, "I know you're used to the old ways, but I don't lead like you did. I lead with data, numbers, and transparency. And I need everyone, including you, to respect that." He didn't answer, but he never made another call after that. If you've ever wished for the chance to rewrite the rules of your life, what comes next might give you a closing chapter worth remembering. Change didn't happen overnight. Some people at the firm still whispered behind my back, still doubted me, still waited for me to fail. But this time, I wasn't alone. I had a team who believed in me, a system that worked, and more than anything, I had myself, whole. No longer begging for anyone's approval. Change came slowly, but it came. And it stayed. My 35th birthday dinner was held at a small Italian restaurant by the edge of Lake Union. Soft golden lights bathed the white tablecloths, and a quiet jazz tune drifted from the corner of the room. I've never liked big parties or rehearsed birthday wishes. But this year, I sent out the invites myself, not to be celebrated, but to mark something else entirely. 1 year since I stepped fully into my own leadership. The dinner was intimate. A few close friends, some members of my investment team, and family. My father arrived early, wearing a dark gray suit and a wine-colored tie. His silver hair was trimmed more neatly than I remembered. He came alone, no advisors, no folders, a strange sign for a man whose entire life had been lived by calendar blocks and commitments. Rachel came too. She sat across from me in a deep blue dress, her face softer now, free from the tension that used to cling to it. Since stepping down as CEO, she'd taken up part-time teaching at a local business school and started working with nonprofit programs for young women. We were no longer quiet rivals. We weren't close, but we were clear, peaceful, and sometimes that's more than enough. The dinner flowed with laughter. No one mentioned work. No one talked about contracts, performance indexes, or market share. We laughed about the lasagna that was slightly overbaked, about the time Rachel spilled coffee on her laptop before a major pitch, or how my father once used TikTok to describe a pocket watch. Then, when dessert came, tiramisu dusted with cocoa spelling out my name, my father unexpectedly stood and raised his glass. The table hushed. I was surprised. He was never one for speeches. He cleared his throat, eyes scanning the table, then landed on me. "Lauren," he began, his voice low but not rigid, When you were born, I named you Lauren because it meant victory earned through one's own effort. Somewhere along the way, I think I forgot that meaning. He looked directly at me. I once believed you were too rational, too independent, too different. And I feared that would pull you away from family, away from the values we held dear. But this past year, I've seen clearly. You held this family name together, not with what I taught you, but with what you discovered on your own, stood up for on your own, and built by your own hands. I don't know when that stillness settled in my chest, not tears, not even emotion, just a quiet calm, as if a door that had been open too long waiting had finally closed. My daughter, he said slowly, I was wrong. You don't have to prove anything anymore. You don't have to surpass anyone or become someone else's idea of success. You are the reason this family name still stands. He lifted his glass higher. I'm proud of you. No one said a word. I could hear the gentle clink of glasses, the wind brushing the window pane, and my own heartbeat. I smiled, not a triumphant grin, not pride, just a true, quiet smile, the kind I hadn't felt in so long sitting among my own family. I stood, touched my glass gently to his. Thank you, Dad, I said, my voice steady, without armor. For the first time in my life, I didn't need to fight for a voice at the table. I didn't have to speak louder, do more, or shrink myself to be accepted. I had been seen, not because I carried the Hayes name, not because I was someone's daughter, but because I was myself. I, Lauren Hayes, no longer lived in anyone's shadow, no longer folded myself to fit into a family mold. I'm still a woman of numbers, of strategy, of sharp edges. But for the first time, I'm also a woman of self-worth, of grace, for myself. And that was the greatest birthday gift I have ever received. Have you ever been in my place, forced to step far outside your family's circle just to find yourself again? Have you ever stayed silent for years, only to reach a day where you finally said, enough? I believe we all have a moment like that, a point where you stop chasing approval and start leading from the truth inside you. If this story reminded you of something in your own life or stirred a thought you'd like to share, please tell me in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Because sometimes, healing begins with a small, honest connection like that. And if you enjoy stories about family, complicated, flawed, but deeply human, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. There's more to come. More journeys into wounds, growth, and the moments of redemption we never thought possible. Thank you for listening. And who knows, maybe the next story will be part of your own memory. See you in the next one.